I am sure some members of BALH will identify with the quote from 1066 and all that. Research into all forms of history can often reveal errors or anomalies in received wisdom concerning matters in the past. Dr. Edward Jenner brought vaccination to the world in the late 18th century, but he was not the person who discovered or invented the procedure. Nor was it something without a precedent. A correct historical account requires consideration of endeavours pursued in much earlier times. The story of vaccination begins with man's efforts to combat smallpox. Treatments in Britain were mere quackery. But on the far side of the world, a measure of intelligence was applied to the problem. A process of infection with a very small dose of the disease itself, variolation, arose in ancient China, reflecting the observation by Thucydides in 630 BC that those who survived an attack of plague rarely caught it again. The Chinese practice arose independently through the same reasoning, and the idea was exported through Silk Route traders to the West in different forms until reaching the Mediterranean and Africa. The Royal Society ignored reports. It wasn't until Lady Mary Wortley Montagu returned from Turkey and influenced her friends at court that versions of the procedure became established in Britain as the inoculation. The technique saved many lives, but was hazardous in the hands of some practitioners, and people died as a result. During 1985, by pure chance I read an inscription on the gravestone of Benjamin Geste in the churchyard of St. Nicholas of Myra at Worth Matravers in Purbeck. It described how he had made the experiment from the cow on his wife and 2 sons in the year 1774. Realizing this was true vaccination and preceded Jenner by 22 years, I began researching, writing, and speaking about this Dorset icon. This has continued to occupy me until the present day. Geste was christened in 1736 in the village of Yetminster in the beautiful Blackmore Vale, Thomas Hardy's Vale of the Little Dairies. Benjamin attended the village school. He grew up within the village, married, and held the tenancy of an old farmhouse named Upbury. He followed his grandfather and father into dairy farming, and was familiar with the country folk notion of the protective powers of cowpox. This mild bovine infection caused lesions to form on the cow's teats and could be transmitted to milkers through abrasions on their hands. Milkmaids were famous for their pure complexions. They did not have the facial pockmarks carried by survivors of smallpox. Geste was a member of the village vestry and responsible for the health of the poor. He had cowpox during his youth. His 2 dairymaids also had a history of the infection and nursed relatives with smallpox without catching it. Benjamin was convinced that somehow cowpox protected against smallpox. During the spring of 1774, Geste took his wife and 2 sons to the hamlet of Chetnall, some 2.5 miles distant. He took them to a farm owned by one William Elford in the area indicated on the tithe map and the 2 photographs, where he knew there were cows with cowpox disease. Geste took a stocking needle with him. Hand knitting of men's knee-length hose was a cottage industry in North Dorset at the time, so his wife would have possessed several sets. On reaching the cattle, he inserted the needle into a cowpox lesion, and then stuck it into his wife's arm just above the elbow. He then repeated this on his sons just below their elbows. These were the world's first vaccinations. When the word of the event got out, he was reviled by the local population. Geste relocated his family to Dunchay Manor in the Isle of Purbeck in 1796. His lease on Upbury had expired, and the Dunchay farm was larger. The word vaccination entered the English language in 1803, coined by a retired naval surgeon named Richard Dunning living in Plymouth. His derivation is from Latin, vacca, the cow. We now know that the virus particle of cowpox is similar to that of smallpox, but of course very different in its biology. Surface antigens of cowpox stimulate an immune response to cowpox, but also to smallpox. Human cowpox disease is very mild and only evidenced by a single lesion on the hand, which soon decays to leave a small mark. It is very important to differentiate between the inoculation with live smallpox, variolation, and vaccination with cowpox. These terms often lead to confusion. However, without Lady Mary's championing of the practice of inoculation in the 18th century, there would have been no vaccination. Vaccination was not a procedure discovered or invented by Geste or Jenner, but like so many things in science and medicine, was a development on what had gone before. Modern smallpox vaccination was performed with a mutant poxvirus named vaccinia. Smallpox was eradicated from the world by the World Health Organization using a combination of surveillance, isolation, and ring vaccination. The latter involved vaccinating contacts, then contacts of contacts. The last case of naturally occurring smallpox was diagnosed on the 26th of October 1977 in Somalia. The last person to die of smallpox was Janet Parker, who was infected through the air conditioning in a research laboratory in Birmingham in 1978. This tragic case led to the Categorization of Pathogens Act and associated containment regulations to prevent it ever happening again. Mention must be made of Dr. Edward Jenner, who is rightly regarded as being the father of vaccination. After rejections, he worked hard to encourage support through his contacts in the gentry, military, and medical fraternities. His first experiment came in 1796, some 22 years after Geste, when he vaccinated a boy named James Phipps by taking cowpox material from the hand of the dairymaid Sarah Nelms. He later infected Phipps with smallpox to show he was immune. In 1798, he did several vaccinations beginning with material taken from a cow, before passaging the virus through a series of children, including 2 named Pead. Jenner became the most decorated person of his generation, but was never knighted. Unfortunately, there are several myths associated with Jenner, as seen in this slide. A significant part of my work has been to find the long-lost oil portrait of Benjamin Geste. This painting has a very convoluted provenance. Painted during 1805 in London by Michael W. Sharp, it was exhibited at Somerset House before passing through several ownerships. It then disappeared at the end of the 19th century. I found it after something of a detective story during 2004 in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. The only image of Geste that existed previously was an engraving made from the painting as seen in my Lancet article. The oil portrait was purchased by the Wellcome Trust as a direct result of my published work. It was repatriated to London in 2006, and after a 2-year restoration, it was exhibited in Dorchester in 2009 and later in London. The painting is now part of the Wellcome Library archive and may be viewed by anyone by prior arrangement. This slide sets out just a few of the conclusions of my many years of research. It is impossible to relate the whole fascinating story of the world's first vaccinator in 10 slides. During my work, I have tried to adopt a balanced approach to a controversial topic by cutting through the myths, prejudices, and subjectivity. I would suggest it warrants further reading. Over the years, my studies have brought me into contact with many eminent people around the world, and this has been very rewarding in itself. Something I would imagine that members of the BALH have experienced themselves. My publisher has recently released an affordable Kindle e-book version of my hardback, Benjamin Geste, the Grandfather of Vaccination. With the Amazon free app, it may be read on any PC, laptop, or tablet, etc., in addition to a Kindle. And possibly a smart fridge or digital iron, though let's put those 2 down as a maybe, shall we? I recommend it to anyone who wishes to proceed further. Thank you for listening.